In his book, Unafraid, Living with Courage and Hope in Uncertain Times, Adam Hamilton tells the story of being raised in Prairie Village, Kansas. Prairie Village is a suburb of Kansas City, and he describes it in his words as an all-white community when he was growing up. That in his neighborhood, at his school, in his church, he did not see people of color on a regular basis, if at all. And he really didn't give it much thought as he was a young person growing up. He was taught very clearly by his parents that they were to respect and treat kindly people of all races, and any kind of negative or derogatory language was not welcome in their home. In school, he learned about the civil rights movement and the heroism of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He learned about the importance of Kansas as a free state and the role that they played in the Underground Railroad. He studied that important Supreme Court case of Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. He was very aware of issues that confronted the African American community. He was very aware of the great work that many African Americans had done to make his community and city and country better. And yet, even in that environment, he knew as much as he knew anything else about growing up in Kansas City, that it was unsafe for him to go to the other side of Troost Avenue. Why? Because the other side of Troost Avenue is where the black community predominantly lived. The white community lived on the west side of Troost. The black community lived on the east side of Troost. And he was taught that a young boy like him, if he went to the other side of Troost Avenue, he would likely be beaten, robbed, and maybe even killed. It wasn't safe for him on the other side of Troost Avenue. Emanuel Cleaver III was also raised in Kansas City, but he lived on the other side of Troost Avenue. He lived on the east side of Troost Avenue. And one afternoon, he is now an ordained pastor in the Methodist Church. Reverend Cleaver and Reverend Hamilton got together for lunch, and as they were having lunch, they were sharing stories of being raised in the Kansas City area. They were raised at about the same time. And as they were sharing stories, Reverend Dr. Cleaver shared this thing with Adam Hamilton. He said, "I learned all kinds of things growing up, but one of the things that I learned about Kansas City is that it wasn't safe for a young boy like me to go to the other side of Troost Avenue. Because a young black man going to the other side of Troost Avenue was likely to be beaten, to be robbed, and maybe even be killed." Two men raised at about the same time in the same city, but on opposite sides of a street that was more than just a street. It was a geographical barrier between two communities of people. Both of these young men felt absolutely safe in their own neighborhoods, but they felt unsafe and threatened in each other's neighborhoods. As they talked about their experiences growing up and how much they've grown just as people and understanding of the world, they recognized that many of the assumptions they carried when they were younger were just wrong and false, and that they were taught to fear each other for reasons that weren't entirely true. And they've pushed beyond those, and they've recognized that, and they've come to a very different place in their lives. But this story reminds us of something that tends to be a struggle for people. It reminds us that of all the things that we fear, often the thing that we fear most is other people. People who we perceive as someone who could cause us harm or take away the life that we know and want to live. People who are different than us. So we might fear someone of a different race. We might fear someone of a different religion. We might fear someone of a different sexual orientation or economic level or education level. We might fear someone of a different political party. Regardless of what the differences are, when we think about who it is that we fear, we can often recognize that our fears are based primarily in difference. The way we live, the way we believe, where we live. all kinds of reasons for us to not know each other fully or understand each other fully, but to recognize that we are different, and that can create fear. Now, as we've been talking about through this series, fear is not always a bad thing. In fact, fear is given to us by God, and fear is something that when it's working right can keep us alive and keep us well and healthy. And there are times when it is perfectly rational for us to fear other people. Throughout human history, nations have gone to war against other nations. And when we are at a time of war, there is justifiable fear toward other people who are wishing us harm. And by the way, those other people are afraid of us. The fear in that circumstance is mutual. At various points in human history, rulers, politicians have used their power to harm other people, to oppress and suppress other people. The ruling class, the wealthy, throughout history have often oppressed and kept down those who were poor or less educated. There are people in the world who perform acts of terror based on their religious or their political ideologies. There are people who engage in criminal behavior where they harm other individuals, maybe even take life and take property. There are times when it is perfectly rational and justifiable for us to be afraid of someone else. That said, sometimes our fear toward the other is a little bit irrational. And sometimes the fears that we have toward others are not based in any truth or in any reality. They're based in assumption, and like those two pastors who found themselves talking about their different childhood experiences, when you cross the street, you find out that the other person really isn't someone that you need to be all that afraid of after all. As we continue this worship series called Unafraid, Living with Courage and Hope, it is really important for us to spend just a little bit of time talking about the fear that we may have toward others. Because when we live in fear of other people for whatever reason, it impacts our life. Living in fear, as much as it can save our life, can take our life and minimize the joy of life. But living in fear toward other people can also impact their lives. Because when we make decisions as a society and a culture that are based in fear, sometimes the decisions that we make can be very harmful for the group that we fear, whether that fear is justified or not. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about the fear of the other, how we might move beyond it, and a wonderful challenge from the gospel and from the teaching of Jesus that can help us to move beyond that fear and maybe turn it down just a little bit. Whether it comes to the fear of the other or other fears that we may have in life, one of the ways that we can treat that fear therapeutically is something called cognitive therapy. I don't know if you've ever heard of cognitive therapy, and I am grossly oversimplifying it here, and any therapists who are among us are going to be rolling your eyes for the next couple of minutes. But basically, this is how cognitive therapy works. It recognizes that often our fears are based on thoughts that aren't real. They're misplaced thoughts, they're distorted thoughts, they're untruths that cause us to fear a situation, an object, or another person. And here's what can happen. When we have a distorted truth, idea, or opinion about something or someone, even if it's based in nothing that is true or real, if we hold that fear long enough, and those ideas go unchecked long enough, they become a part of who we are. And so what happens is when we encounter that object, that thing, that situation, or that person that we're afraid of, before we can even recognize what's going on, we have an automatic thought that tells us that that person, that thing, that situation is dangerous. And it doesn't matter whether the reasons we think it's dangerous are real or not, we're owning them as though they are. So what cognitive therapy does is it sits with the client, it sits with the person who's struggling with this perceived fear and offers facts, offers reality, helps them to see Perhaps that all spiders aren't out to kill them, right? And it goes over that and offers facts and ideas that alter, that contradict those fears. And that's something that we can also do when it comes to fear of the other, the reason we might be afraid of someone else. We can look at what's actually going on, and we can replace our automatic thoughts with something that's a little bit more based in reality. And when we begin to see other people in ways that are real and beyond just irrational fears, then we start to find room to be less afraid and more loving toward them. Now, there are all kinds of ways that we see this happening, but I'm going to give you just a couple examples today of what I'm talking about and how we can maybe adjust some of our thinking and fears. And these are two big examples, but they speak to other examples as well. For example, let's think about crime. And the reason that I want to talk about crime right now is when we talk about crime, there has to be another person involved in that, right? Crime doesn't just happen out there in the world on its own. Crime is done by people who are engaging in criminal activity. So when we talk about crime and we talk about criminals, we are talking about people. We are talking about an other. Every year, Gallup does this polling about crime and about how Americans feel about crime. They do it every single year. I'm going to give you stats from 2016. In 2016, they asked people the question, how worried are you about crime? 53% of Americans in 2016 said they were highly worried about crime, very worried about crime. Another 26% of Americans said that they were fairly worried about crime. So more than just average worry, it was an elevated worry or concern. So between the two, in 2016, 79% of those who were polled in the United States had a heightened worry about crime in America. Another question that they asked them, and again, they've been asking this question every year, is do you believe that crime rates have gone up or gone down over last year? Here's a graph that shows the trend line of how people respond to that question. The top line is the line that represents people who said, yes, I believe crime rates have increased. And if you look at that, what you see is it kind of fluctuates. It's higher some years, lower some years, up, down a little bit here and there. But on average, it's roughly in the upper 60s to lower 70% range of people when asked year over year since 1989, do you believe that crime has gone up over last year or down over last year? The bottom line represents people who believed it went down. Top line represents the people who believed it went up. So the bottom line, it averages, somewhere around the upper teens, lower 20s. That's the percentage of people who believe that the crime rate went down year over year. Well, thanks to statisticians at the FBI and the criminal records that they keep there, we actually know the truth as to whether crime has gone up or down since 1989. And here's the answer. It has gone down. And it has gone down a lot. Since the early 1990s, crime rates in the United States of America have dropped by over 50%. Most years, year after year, the crime rate has dropped. Yes, there have been some years where it's gone up. It actually ticked up in 15 and 16. It's come down a little bit in 17. So there are some years where those folks who said that are right. But even when it's gone up overall, we are living in a much safer environment than we were in the early 1990s. And yet, most people believe that crime has continued to escalate. Most people don't know this stat. This comes right from the FBI. This is about violent crimes, property crimes, and nonviolent crimes have followed the same trend. Right? It's followed the same trend. So what's happened is we've got this huge perception gap. And the perception gap is between the public idea and understanding of what's happening when it comes to crime and the reality of what's happening when it comes to crime. Now, I want to be very clear here. The ultimate reality when it comes to crime is that there would be none. I am not undervaluing the impact of crime, property or violent. Any amount of crime is too much, it's devastating, it's frightening, and it's worrisome. I also want to talk about how grateful I am for people, including law enforcement officers in our congregation, who do everything they can day after day to reduce that number, and clearly their efforts are making a difference. That said, there is a gap between our perception of how at risk we are in terms of crime than the reality. Did you know that for every person who's murdered in the United States of America each year, 40 people die of heart disease? You are 40 times more likely to die of heart disease than to die because of an act of criminal violence towards you. 40 times. Yet when we ask, what are you most afraid of? Heart disease never even registers. No one talks about it. And that's impacting us, right? Look, I know someone who lives in a statistically safe suburban area of a major United States city. Their suburb is statistically safe, right? But this person is so afraid of being violently assaulted that when they go grocery shopping, she has her husband drop her off right next to the door so that she can go in, because she's concerned that if they park in the parking lot, she's going to be exposed to dangerous criminal elements until she gets inside, right? But then she goes inside. I know them, so I know what their diet looks like. They go inside and fill their cart with things that most doctors would say, hey, that's pretty detrimental to your life, right? It's going to increase your risk for heart disease and other physical ailments that may cause you to die prematurely, right? They're 40 times more likely to have their life ended prematurely by the things they're choosing to put in their shopping cart than getting from the car into the grocery store. But their fear is so heightened about violent crime that they're scared to step outside their door. And I'm telling you, that's impacting their life. It's impacting the way they experience the world. And it's not necessary, because their ideas about their risk levels are incorrect. They're not accurate. They are living in fear, and the fear is largely false. It doesn't mean it won't happen, but the odds are pretty slim in comparison to other things that could be at risk. Here's the other thing that's happening for them. As they imagine someone attacking them in the parking lot, they've got a face to that someone. And it may be a blurry face, it may not be specific, but they've got an idea of who their assailant is going to be. And that's why it's important when we talk about who the other is. Because if they say, I'm afraid I'm going to get attacked, they're afraid of someone who's going to attack them. And so they're filling that hole with an image of someone. And whatever that image is, even if it's unconscious, whenever they encounter that image in another person, they immediately become afraid. It's not intentional. It happens before they even know it's happening. It's that distorted thinking, right? Here's another example. We all know that there are people who commit acts of terrorism in the name of the Muslim faith. Again, any act of terrorism is unacceptable. The number should be 0 in a perfect world. I am not minimizing any death that has been caused through Islamic terrorism, and I am extremely grateful for the men and women who work every day to reduce that number, both in the United States and abroad. I am very grateful about that. Terrorism is a real threat, and it is something that we should be aware of. And it's okay that it causes us some fear. But I do think this is where my question lies. My question is our fear equal to the proportion of the risk we face from Islamic terrorism? Right? So since 9/11, I'm just going to run some statistics by you. I had to write them down because no way can I remember that. Since 9/11, in the United States of America, there have been about 100 deaths that we can directly attribute to Islamic terrorism. So since 9/11, 100 deaths that we can directly attribute to Islamic terrorism. In that same period of time, there have been 9,600 people die from lightning strikes. There have been 160,000 people who have suffered death by homicide, who've been murdered. 560,000 people have died in automobile accidents. You are 120 times more likely to be struck by lightning than to be a victim of an Islamic terrorist attack. You are 2,000 times more likely to be murdered by a non-Muslim U.S. citizen than you are to be a victim of an Islamic terrorist attack. I was having this conversation with my oldest son. We were going to see a movie, and we were talking about something. He said, Dad, are you afraid of terrorists? And I said, well, I mean, I'm concerned about it, but I don't think about it on a daily basis. He goes, yeah, I don't either. He goes, but I do get nervous going to the movies. Because it seems like people get shot up in the movies on a pretty regular basis. And statistically, he's right. You're more at risk from that than you are a terrorist, but even statistically, the odds of that are pretty small, so I reassured him about that. You are 7,000 times more likely to die just by accident. Just by accident. 7,000 times more likely to die of an accidental cause than you are to be a victim of an Islamic terrorist attack. Quick question. How many of you change light bulbs on a chair? Right? How many of you do it? Now, how many of you do it even though there's a step stool within 2 minutes of your current location? Exactly. Stop that. Stop that. This will kill you, and it's very dangerous. You need to stop that. You are far more likely to die changing your light bulb in your stocking feet on a chair than you are to die as a victim of an Islamic terrorist attack. Now listen, I am not minimizing. Do not leave here and say, that dude was minimizing Islamic terrorism. No, I'm not. We got to do everything we can to stop that. And people are working hard to stop that. And it's right that we be aware of it. But, I mean, come on, right? We got to keep it in perspective or our fears are going to get the best of us. Did you know that according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, 90% of Islamic terrorist attacks take place in majority Muslim countries. 90% of the victims of Islamic terrorism are other Muslims. This is not a clash of culture against culture. It's an act of terrorism by religious extremists who are doing things to terrorize people, and the people they're killing the most are of their own religion. Many people do not know that statistic. But it's right there for the taking if you go and look for it. Here's the top 10 causes of death in 2016. Heart disease, cancer, changing your light bulb on a chair, chronic lower respiratory disease, stroke, Alzheimer's, diabetes, flu, pneumonia, kidney disease, suicide. These are the top 10 causes of death in 2016. Total deaths from those causes, 2,034,119. Total murders in 2016, 17,250. I am not minimizing the deaths from murders or from Islamic terrorism. There were 49 in 2016 because that's when the San Bernardino attack took place. We average about 6 a year, but that year was particularly high. I am not minimizing those deaths by murders or by terrorism. I am not. But when we think about the fears that we have, the things that we worry about, which of these things do you worry about most, and which of these things do you hear people talk about most? Is it the list of top 10 that I shared with you, or is it these two things? And maybe a couple other things smattered in. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't be afraid of violent assault, and I'm not suggesting we shouldn't be afraid of terrorism, but what I am suggesting is that the single most dangerous person in your life is you. You are the single most dangerous person. You are the biggest threat in your life. I am the biggest threat to my health and well-being. The way I drive, the way I eat, the way I drink, the way I engage in daily activities, the way I change light bulbs on chairs instead of with a stool, the way I attempt to fix electrical problems in my house. Don't do that either. Don't do that either. I've only almost died 3 times. No joke. I'm a slow learner. Right? We are the single greatest threat to our health and to our well-being. And yet when we think about what really has got us scared, it's more often than not other people, right? And why is this so important? Because fear dictates decision-making. It dictates how we live our lives every day. It dictates how we vote. It dictates the public policies we put in place. It dictates all of that. And sometimes when we respond out of fear, we don't reflect our best selves, right? We don't reflect our best selves. One of the things that I want you to remember when it comes to fear, especially fear of others, facts are your friend. Facts are your friend. Remember the words of Jesus. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Jesus wasn't talking about these issues, but Jesus was talking about the importance of knowing the truth and knowing facts, because facts help us to keep things in perspective and to really know what's going on so that we don't get distorted thinking. And what happens in our community and in our society is people take facts and they own them for themselves and they use them to create fear. And by creating fear, they get us to act in certain ways. When you hear someone speaking in ways that is meant to raise fear in you or in others, please, 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 do some research to discover whether the facts they're using are accurate and being used in the right way. And when you hear someone pressing back against them, check their facts. We are lucky in the fact that we live in a time where we can go and find out this information on our own, right? I know the internet can be a really weird place and some of the things that are out there are not true, but if you dig hard enough and you look hard enough and you do the work that you need to do, you can get the stats. You can get the facts. And whenever you're afraid, remember that facts are your friends. Go and look and see what the reality is for you in your life and what's going on so that you can turn down that fear just a little bit. The thing that our faith teaches us in the midst of this that I think turns down our fear more than others is that, more than anything else, is that we're taught to love in the image of Jesus Christ. And the word that Jesus uses isn't some sappy emotional thing. It's agape. It's an action word. It's a verb. It's something that you're supposed to do. We're supposed to love our neighbors. We're supposed to love our enemies. We're supposed to love all children of God as we love ourselves. It is a lean-in kind of love. We see that kind of love in the story of Adam Hamilton and Reverend Cleaver, Emmanuel Cleaver, as they sat and talked and they overcame their differences and learned to understand one another. That's the call of Christ happening right there. You know, the work we're doing with our brothers and sisters of the Muslim faith here in Louisville, the outreach that we've shared together, the meals that we've shared together, the service projects and the worship that we've shared together, that's work that's helping us to see them not as another, but as people. Every time we gather in this sanctuary and when we gather in this sanctuary and say everyone is welcome here without exception, it matters not their race, their religion, their nationality, their sexual orientation, their political party, their education level, their economic level. When we say all, we mean all, and every time we say it, we are expressing the gospel of Jesus Christ in a clear and hopefully hope-giving manner. Because how we talk about others and how we treat others, it matters. And the gospel calls us to lean in with love. Look at these words from the book of 1 John. God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. Love has been perfected among us in this, that we may have boldness on the day of judgment, because as he is, so are we in this world. There is no fear in love. But perfect love casts out fear, for fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. We love because he first loved us. Those who say, I love God, and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. The commandment we have from him is this: those who love God must love their brothers and sisters also. At the heart of this passage is something that we often overlook when we talk about why God calls us to love other people. The reason God calls us to love other people is because love casts out fear. And the more perfectly we love others, the more we cast out that fear. And God wants us to live and love others so that we are not living in fear, so that we are getting to know and getting to move beyond those things. There's one last image that I want to share with you from Hamilton's book because it's so captivating to me. Hamilton writes a very powerful reminder that we all need to keep in mind. In heaven, there is no Troost Avenue. In heaven, there is no Troost Avenue. In heaven, there is no East or West Louisville. In heaven, there is no difference of economic strata or educational strata or race or national. There's all of those things, those barriers that we create here, those creations of the others that we create here, those things do not exist in heaven. We are reconciled with God and we are reconciled with one another. There is no Troost Avenue in heaven. Every single time we pray the Lord's Prayer, what do we say? That your will be done on earth as it is done where? In heaven. Friends, we have some work to do because there's still Troost Avenues on earth. And they may not come by that name and they may come in a lot of different forms, but they are barriers between us and others. And those barriers are causing fear. And much of that fear is unwarranted. And God calls us to press and to move beyond those barriers so that we can love more boldly and more faithfully. And when we do that, we find that we actually can live lives that are more unafraid. Hope and courage can be our guide, even in the most uncertain of days. Amen.